The wheel cracked so loudly that every passenger inside the coach jolted forward. Elinor Voss grabbed the leather strap above the window with both hands and held on as the vehicle lurched sideways, tipping at an angle before coming to a grinding, shuddering stop. Outside, the coachman was already shouting. A horse whinnied. Someone behind Elinor let out a short, sharp cry, and then there was only the sound of wind moving through the trees that lined both sides of the road. Elinor steadied herself and looked out the window. They were on a wide stone road she did not recognize. The sun was low and pale behind thick cloud cover, and the fields on either side were empty and frost-touched. She had been traveling since early that morning from Aldenmore, her small village, and she had expected to arrive in Harrogate before dark. That was no longer going to happen. The coachman opened the door and leaned in, his face red from the cold and from the embarrassment of the situation. He told the passengers that the rear left wheel had cracked on the stone ridge and that the coach could not move safely until the wheel was replaced or repaired. He said the nearest place of shelter was Dunmore Hall, which could be seen from the road if one looked north through the trees. He said the estate had been informed and that a groom was already walking toward them to offer assistance. He said it would take at least 2 hours, possibly 3. 2 of the passengers made sounds of loud complaint. A heavy-set man in a brown coat said this was unacceptable. A woman in an expensive hat said she had a dinner engagement and would hold the coachman personally responsible for her inconvenience. The coachman nodded and said very little. Elinor picked up her leather satchel from the floor, checked that her mother's locket was still safely around her neck, and stepped out of the coach onto the road. The cold hit her immediately. Her dress, which had once been a soft blue but had faded over the years to something closer to gray, was not built for this kind of wind. She had a short wool coat over it, but the coat had a thin lining and 2 of its buttons were missing. She had meant to replace them before this journey. She had not found the time. She stood on the road and looked toward the trees the coachman had pointed to. Through the bare branches she could see the top of a building. Stone walls, high and pale, with dark windows catching what little light remained in the sky. Dunmore Hall. She had heard the name before. Every person in the surrounding counties had heard the name before. It belonged to a family of old wealth and older reputation, and it sat on land that stretched further than most people could walk in a full day. The groom who came to escort them was a young man named Peter who wore the estate's dark green livery and apologized 3 or 4 times as he led the group of 7 passengers along a gravel path through the trees. The woman in the expensive hat complained the entire way. The man in the brown coat walked behind her and agreed with everything she said. Elinor walked at the back of the group, carrying her satchel, watching where she placed her feet on the uneven gravel. The front entrance of Dunmore Hall was enormous. 2 stone steps led up to a set of double doors that were already open, and warm light spilled out from the interior. A woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Colby, the head housekeeper, stood at the door and welcomed them inside with the careful politeness of someone who was used to receiving unexpected visitors and preferred not to show whether she found it welcome or not. She told them that the drawing room had been opened for their comfort and that tea would be brought shortly. The man in the brown coat said he would prefer something stronger. Mrs. Colby said she would see what could be arranged. Elinor stepped inside. The entrance hall was tall and wide, with a floor of pale stone and walls paneled in dark wood. 2 large chandeliers hung from the ceiling, already lit, throwing light across the space in all directions. There were paintings on the walls, portraits mostly, and a staircase at the far end that curved upward and disappeared from view. 2 large vases stood at the foot of the staircase, filled with arrangements of dried branches and winter flowers that smelled faintly of cedar. Elinor had never been inside a building like this in her life. She did not gasp. She did not stop walking and stare with her mouth open, the way one of the younger passengers did for a full 3 seconds before catching herself. Elinor looked at the room carefully, the way she looked at everything, taking it in piece by piece and storing it quietly somewhere behind her eyes. She noticed the crack in the plaster above the left chandelier. She noticed that one of the paintings on the far wall was hanging slightly crooked. She noticed that the vases, as beautiful as they were, needed fresh water. She was a seamstress. She noticed details. It was the thing that had kept her employed and fed for the past 4 years since her mother died and left her the small house in Aldenmore and 32 shillings and not much else. The other passengers followed Mrs. Colby toward the drawing room. Elinor followed too, but she slowed near the foot of the staircase because the child appeared so suddenly that there was almost no time to react. She was small, perhaps 4 years old, with dark curly hair and a nightgown that was entirely wrong for the hour and the cold. She came running down the last few steps of the staircase at a speed that was alarming. and she would have collided with Elinor directly if Elinor had not stepped sideways and caught her by both shoulders with her hands. The child looked up. Her face was wet. She had been crying for some time, and the crying had reached the stage where the tears had mostly stopped, but the breathing had not yet settled. She was hiccuping very slightly with each breath, and her lower lip was trembling, and her eyes were wide and very dark. Elinor knelt down immediately, right there on the stone floor of the entrance hall, so that her face was level with the child's face. She asked very gently what the matter was. The child stared at her. Elinor did not rush. She simply held the child's shoulders lightly and waited, and the waiting was the most important thing, because children who are distressed need to be waited for. They cannot be hurried into explaining themselves. The child's name, it turned out, was Flora. She was 4 years old. She had been put to bed by her nursemaid, who was called Ruth, but Ruth had gone downstairs to help with the unexpected guests and had not come back, and Flora had woken up and found herself alone and had come to look for her. Flora communicated this information in small pieces, between shallow breaths, with one hand gripping the banister post beside her. Elinor listened to every piece. Then she told Flora that her name was Elinor, and that Ruth was almost certainly downstairs and very well and not lost at all, and that the two of them would go and find her together if that seemed like a good idea. Flora considered this for a moment. Then she nodded and held out her hand. Elinor took it, and they walked together toward the drawing room. It was at that moment, standing in the doorway between the entrance hall and the corridor, that the man was watching. Elinor did not see him. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, near a door that led to what appeared to be a study, and he was standing in shadow. He was tall and wearing plain dark clothes, the kind of clothes that did not announce themselves, and he had been there for less than a minute. He had come out of the study because Peter had informed him that the passengers from the broken coach had arrived, and he had intended to ask Mrs. Colby if all was well. Instead, he had stopped. He had stopped because of what he saw in the entrance hall, not the passengers, who were filing toward the drawing room with various degrees of inconvenience written across their faces. Not the hall itself, which he had walked through more times than he could count without really seeing it anymore. He had stopped because of the woman in the gray dress who had caught a running child and immediately knelt on the stone floor without hesitation or consideration for her clothing or her dignity, and who was now holding the child's hand and walking with her as though this were the most natural thing in the world. He watched her until they disappeared around the corner. Then he stood very still for a moment in the corridor. His name was Edmund Ashford. He was 31 years old. He was the Duke of Dunmore, the sole owner of this estate and everything on it, and he had not been genuinely moved by anything he observed in more than 3 years. He remained in the corridor for another few seconds. Then he turned and went back into the study and closed the door behind him. In the drawing room, Ruth the nursemaid had burst in through a side door and was gathering Flora into her arms with a mixture of relief and guilt, apologizing to everyone within hearing range for the disturbance. Flora, now entirely recovered, was patting Ruth's face with one small hand and looking pleased with the outcome of events. Elinor sat in a chair near the window and accepted a cup of tea from a footman and looked out at the dark garden through the glass. She thought about her cousin, Charles. Charles had written to her 3 months ago with the news that the textile house where he worked was in need of a seamstress with real skill, that the pay was fair and the lodgings were clean, and that Harrogate was a good city with good people and she would do well there. She had read the letter 4 times. She had asked her neighbor, old Mrs. Peel, what she thought. Mrs. Peel had said that at 24, with no husband and no family left, and a house that needed a new roof, Elinor had very little to lose and perhaps quite a lot to gain. Elinor had agreed. She had spent 3 weeks in careful preparation. She had made small repairs to her clothing, though not all of them, because the thread had run out and the market day had been rained off. She had packed what she owned that was worth packing. She had sold the house to a young couple from the neighboring village for a price that was fair but not generous, and she had put the money with the 32 shillings her mother had left her, and she had boarded the coach at 6:30 in the morning with her leather satchel and her mother's locket, and a clear and simple plan. The plan had lasted until the wheel cracked. She sipped her tea and looked at the frost on the garden grass and thought with great practicality about what happened now. If the repair took 2 hours, she might still arrive in Harrogate before 10 o'clock. Charles had said he would wait up for her regardless of the hour. The textile house was on Aldgate Street and the sign above the door was painted green. She knew exactly where to go. Everything would be fine. She was very good at telling herself that everything would be fine. In the corridor beyond the drawing room, a door opened quietly and then closed. No one in the drawing room noticed. The man in the dark clothes had crossed the entrance hall toward the staircase, pausing for just a moment near the doorway of the drawing room. He looked in. He saw the woman in the gray dress sitting alone near the window, holding her teacup in both hands, looking out at the garden with an expression that was not sad exactly, but was the expression of someone who was working something through in their mind, and doing it quietly and without troubling anyone else with it. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he went upstairs. The coachman came to the drawing room at just after 7 in the evening and said the wheel could not be repaired that night. The stone road had broken the wooden spoke in a way that required a replacement part that was not available in the immediate area. He would need to send to the nearest town in the morning. It meant one night at least before the journey could continue. The passengers reacted in various ways. The woman in the expensive hat made a long series of complaints directly to Mrs. Colby, who absorbed them with professional calm. The man in the brown coat drank a second glass of what Mrs. Colby had arranged and looked resigned. The other passengers made the best of it. Elinor set down her teacup and said nothing, and did not complain because complaining was not going to fix the wheel or move the coach or change the night into morning any faster. Mrs. Colby came to each passenger individually and explained that the estate was able to offer guest rooms for the evening at no cost, that dinner would be served at 8, and that fresh water and basic necessities would be provided. When she came to Elinor, she paused for a moment and then said, with a slightly softer tone than she had used with the others, that she had heard what Elinor did with the young Miss Flora, and that it was very kind. Elinor said it was not a very difficult thing to do. Mrs. Colby looked at her for a moment. Then she said the guest room at the end of the east corridor had the warmest fireplace, and she would have it made up for Elinor first. Elinor thanked her genuinely, because genuine thanks was the least a person could offer for genuine kindness, and she picked up her satchel and followed the housemaid upstairs. The room was warm. It was also the most beautiful room Elinor had ever slept in, though she was careful not to let that fact affect her composure. The bed was wide and had 4 posts and white linen that smelled of dried lavender. There was a fireplace with a fire already built and burning, and a chair near it, and a small table with a candle and a cloth and a basin of water. There was a window with thick curtains, and when Elinor pulled them back she could see the whole dark garden below, and beyond it the field that stretched away toward the tree line, and beyond that the faint gray outline of hills against a darker sky. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about her mother, because she often did when she was somewhere new and alone. Her mother's name had been Alice, and Alice had been a seamstress before Elinor and had taught her everything: how to hold a needle, how to read the grain of a fabric, how to make a stitch so small and even that it disappeared into the cloth and left only the intended shape behind. Alice had also taught her less obvious things: how to be still in a room full of noise, how to listen more than she spoke, how to look at a person carefully and understand something about them before they had said very much at all. Elinor had used every one of these things every single day since Alice died. She held the locket in her fingers in the dark. It was small and oval and made of brass that had gone golden with age and handling. Inside it was a tiny painted portrait of Alice, done when Alice was about Elinor's age, with her hair pinned up and her expression that particular mix of serious and warm that Elinor remembered from every morning of her childhood. She kissed the locket the way she always did. Then she went to the basin and washed her face and hands and sat in the chair by the fire and opened the one book she had packed in her satchel and read until dinner was called. She did not know, as she sat by that fire in the warm room with the lavender linen and the frost-touched garden below the window, that the man in the dark clothes had asked Mrs. Colby before dinner which guest was in the east corridor room. She did not know that Mrs. Colby had told him her name. She did not know that he had stood outside the closed door of that room for 4 seconds before turning and walking away without knocking. She did not know any of it. She was reading her book. She was thinking about Aldgate Street and the green-painted sign and the plan that had been briefly interrupted by a cracked wheel on a stone road. She was not thinking about anything as large or as unlikely as what was already, quietly and without her knowledge, beginning. Dinner was served at 8. The dining room was not the formal one, which was far too large for 7 stranded travelers, but a smaller room with a round table and candles, and a fire at one end that made the whole space feel enclosed and almost easy. The other passengers had softened considerably since the afternoon. Hot food and warm rooms had a way of doing that to people. The woman in the expensive hat had removed it and turned out to be quite pleasant once unburdened of her accessory. The man in the brown coat had become talkative in an inoffensive way and told a long story about a journey he had once taken to Scotland that had also involved a broken vehicle, in that case a wagon, and had ended improbably with him sleeping in a barn and befriending a very large goat. Elinor listened and ate and spoke when she was spoken to. A footman refilled her water glass twice. The food was simple but good: a thick soup, bread that was still warm from the oven, roasted vegetables, a piece of chicken. Elinor ate carefully, and with genuine appreciation, because she had not eaten since the hard roll and apple she had packed for the journey, and she was hungry in the way that only a long day of cold travel can produce. She was near the end of the meal when the door at the far end of the dining room opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, she noticed that first. He was wearing dark clothes, the same dark clothes she had not seen on him in the corridor earlier because she had not known he was there. He had a straight posture and a serious face and dark eyes that moved across the room in a way that was not unkind but was not particularly warm either. He said from the doorway that he hoped the passengers were comfortable and that Mrs. Colby had seen to everything they needed. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience of the situation and that the estate was glad to host them for the evening. The man in the brown coat said it was very generous. The woman who had worn the hat said the soup was exceptional and asked who his cook was. One of the other passengers said something about the road conditions that the man received with a polite nod. Then his eyes moved to the end of the table where Elinor was sitting, and stopped. She looked back at him without any particular expression. She did not know who he was, she had not asked, and no one had mentioned a name. She simply looked at him the way she looked at everyone, directly, clearly, without either challenge or performance. He held her gaze for just a moment longer than he held the others. Then he said good evening to the table and withdrew. The man in the brown coat waited until the door had closed and then leaned forward and said, in a lowered voice that everyone at the table could still easily hear, that that was the Duke of Dunmore himself, and was it not something to have had dinner in his house? Elinor looked at the closed door. Then she looked back at her plate and took the last piece of bread and thought about how he had looked at her. She had not been able to read his expression. That was unusual for her. She was good at reading expressions. She had been doing it all her life. It bothered her slightly, in the small private way that unexplained things tend to bother a careful person. She tucked it away and finished her bread and did not think about it again that night. Or so she told herself. The fire in her room had burned low when she returned to it. She built it back up with the logs stacked beside the hearth, the way her mother had taught her, with the smaller pieces first and the larger ones set carefully on top to catch properly. She changed into her night clothes, which were clean and modest and folded at the bottom of her satchel, and she climbed into the wide bed with the lavender linen and pulled the covers up. The house was quiet around her. A large house at night has its own particular kind of quiet, which is different from the quiet of a small house or a field or a road. It has weight and depth and a low, settled sound that is almost like breathing. Elinor lay in it and stared at the ceiling. She was thinking, she told herself, about Aldgate Street, about the textile house with the green sign, about what she would say to Charles when she arrived, about the work that waited for her and what it might mean if it went well and she was able, in a year or two, to put something aside and build something small and solid and her own. She was not thinking about dark eyes that moved across a room and then stopped. She was not thinking about that at all. She closed her eyes and she was asleep in less than 10 minutes, which was a thing she had always been able to do and was grateful for, because sleep was one of the few things in her life that had never failed her. Outside the window, the frost crept further across the garden grass. The tree line stood still in the windless dark. The hills beyond were invisible now, absorbed into the sky. Somewhere in the large and quiet house, a clock marked the hour, 9 soft strokes that moved through the walls and the corridors and the rooms without disturbing anyone. In a room at the other end of the house, the Duke of Dunmore sat at his desk with a book open in front of him that he had not read a single line of in 40 minutes. He was looking at the lamp. He was thinking about a woman in a grey dress who had knelt on the floor of his entrance hall without a second thought and held a frightened child by both shoulders with steady hands. He turned one page of the book. He read 3 words. He stopped. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the dinner table. Straight, clear, no flattery and no intimidation, just a person looking at another person and taking them as they were. He could not remember the last time someone had looked at him that way. He closed the book. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the frost and the dark. Tomorrow the wheel would be repaired and the coach would be ready and the passengers would leave and the house would return to its usual order and he would return to his usual life, which was organized and purposeful and empty in a way he had learned not to examine too closely. That was the sensible shape of things. He knew that. He understood it clearly. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the dark garden below, where the frost was silver in the moonlight and the frozen grass did not move at all. The morning came gray and cold, the way mornings in that part of the country often did between late autumn and the first true sign of spring. Elena was awake before the housemaid knocked to bring her wash water. She had always been an early riser. Her mother had been one too, and some habits are given to a person long before they are old enough to choose them for themselves. She dressed carefully in the same dress she had arrived in because it was the only one she had with her. She smoothed the skirt and checked the collar and made sure the buttons were straight. The dress was worn. She knew it was worn. She had known it for 2 years and had intended to replace it and had not yet managed to, because there were always more immediate needs, and the replacing of her own clothing came last on every list she made. She brushed her hair and pinned it up neatly and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was, a woman of limited means who was neat and capable and entirely unintimidating to anyone who was comfortable in rooms like this one, which was not her. But she had learned that discomfort was not the same as incapability, and she carried the distinction with her wherever she went. She went down to breakfast. The dining room had been set again, with bread and boiled eggs and a pot of strong tea and a dish of preserves that smelled of summer fruit. 3 of the other passengers were already there. The woman who had been wearing the hat was present and in better spirits than the evening before, and she said good morning to Elena in a way that was genuinely pleasant. The man in the brown coat was eating his egg with great concentration. A young couple who had sat near the front of the coach the day before were talking quietly to each other about their travel plans now that the schedule had shifted. Elena poured herself tea and took a piece of bread and sat at the end of the table near the window. The garden was visible now in the morning light. It was not in its best season. The grass was stiff with frost and the flower beds were bare, cut back to low dark stems, but the structure of it was still clear. The paths laid in a careful grid, the low hedges that bordered each section, the stone bench at the far end beside what appeared to be a dormant rose bed. Someone had designed this garden with great care and tended it with equal care, and even in winter its bones were evident. Elena liked that. She liked things that held their structure even when they had been stripped back. It was, she thought, an honest quality. She was looking at the stone bench when she heard the door open. She knew before she looked. She was not sure how she knew. Some combination of the way the other passengers shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight straightening, a small collective attention that told her before her eyes confirmed it. She looked, and he was there. Edmund Ashford came into the breakfast room wearing the same kind of plain dark clothes he had worn the night before. He said good morning to the room. The room said good morning back with varying degrees of formality. He poured himself tea and stood near the sideboard rather than sitting down, the way a man might stand in a room that is his own, but in which he does not wish to impose. Elena looked at him and then looked back at the garden. She heard him move. She heard the sound of his tea cup being set on the saucer. She heard him take 2 or 3 steps and then stop. He had stopped near the end of the table, near her end. He said, without any particular preamble, that he hoped she had slept well. She looked up. He was looking at her. Not at the garden, not at his tea, not at the general company of the room. At her specifically in the way that made it clear the remark was directed at her and not at the room in general. She said that she had slept very well, thank you. He asked if the room had been comfortable. She said that it had been very comfortable and that she was grateful for the hospitality. He nodded, then he said in the same conversational tone that he had observed her with Flora the previous evening. Elena waited. She was not sure whether this was leading somewhere or whether it was simply an observation. He said that Flora was the daughter of his estate manager, who had been unwell for several weeks, and that Ruth the nursemaid was generally very attentive, but had been stretched thin recently with the illness in the household. He said that the child had been difficult to settle in the evenings and that he had not seen her calm with a stranger before. Elinor said that children who are frightened often calm down quite quickly if they are given time and not hurried. He looked at her as though she had said something worth thinking about. She had not said anything particularly remarkable. She had simply stated a thing that she had observed to be true. He asked her where she was traveling to. She told him Harrogate. She told him about her cousin Charles and the textile house on Aldgate Street and the work that was waiting for her there. He asked what kind of work. She said she was a seamstress. He looked at her hands. It was a brief look, not impolite, just the look of a person who has been told something and looks for the evidence of it. Her hands were on the table. They were the hands of a seamstress, capable, with small calluses at the fingertips from years of needlework and faint marks at the pad of her right thumb from the thimble she used. He looked back up. He said that seamstresses were rare, meaning the good ones, and asked how long she had been doing it. She said since she was about 10 years old, when her mother began teaching her properly. She said her mother had been a seamstress too. He asked if her mother was still in Aldenmore. She said her mother had died 4 years ago. The room was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet, but the kind that follows a plain statement of loss, when there is nothing sensible to say in response, and the honest thing is simply to let the statement stand. He let it stand. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated anything he might have said. Then he asked carefully whether the cousin in Harrogate was expecting her today. She said yes, Charles was expecting her whenever she arrived, that he had said he would wait regardless of the hour. He said he was glad of that, because the wheel was proving more complicated than expected. The replacement part had been located in the town of Selbrook, which was 12 miles north, and a rider had been sent early that morning, but it would not arrive until the early afternoon at the earliest. The passengers would not be able to depart until at least 3 o'clock, and if there were any further delays it might be 4. Elinor processed this information. She said thank you for telling her. He said she was welcome. Then he said something that she had not expected. He said that the estate had a room where fabric work was sometimes done, a small room off the east wing where the household linens were stored and repaired, and that if she found herself without occupation during the delay, she was welcome to use it. There were needles and thread and fabric there if she had a mind for it. She looked at him. He held her gaze with that same unreadable expression, not warm exactly, not cold either, simply direct the way a person is direct when they have stopped performing for an audience and are simply saying what they mean. She asked why he was making the offer. He said that she looked like a person who would find an idle morning considerably more troubling than a working one. The woman who had been wearing the hat made a small sound that might have been a suppressed smile. Elinor did not look at her. She looked at the Duke of Dunmore and recognized something in what he had said that was accurate in a way she had not expected a stranger to perceive about her. She said thank you. She said she would be very glad of the room. He nodded. He said Mrs. Colby would show her where it was. Then he said good morning to the room again, set down his teacup and left. The man in the brown coat waited exactly 3 seconds and then said, in a voice that was just quiet enough to pretend it was private, that the Duke had never once in his memory offered a delayed traveler anything beyond a bed and a meal, and that this was something quite outside the usual. Elinor ate her bread and said nothing. But she was thinking about the way he had looked at her hands, not with any improper intent, simply with attention, as though the evidence of her work was something he found worth acknowledging rather than politely overlooking. She was not accustomed to being seen that way. It was, she found, an unusually difficult thing to set aside. Mrs. Colby showed her to the workroom after breakfast. It was exactly as described, a small, warm room with a south-facing window that let in good daylight, shelves along one wall lined with folded linens, a table in the center, and a basket near the door containing threads, needles, a pair of scissors, and a pincushion shaped like a tomato. There was a chair at the table and a lamp on a bracket above it that could be lit if the daylight failed. It was a good room. It was a working room. It smelled of clean cloth and cedar, and faintly of the lavender that seemed to be present everywhere in this house. Elinor set her satchel down and took off her coat and rolled up her sleeves and looked at the basket. She picked up a length of thread and a needle and sat down at the table. She did not have her own work with her because she had packed only what was necessary for the journey, which was not much. But she noticed on the top shelf a stack of household napkins that had been set aside with a small card placed on top of them. She picked up the card. It said in a housekeeper's practical handwriting, to be mended when time allows. She looked at the napkins. 3 of them had frayed hems, 2 had small tears near the fold. 1 had a stain that had been washed but left a faint shadow, which was not something thread would fix but was interesting regardless. She took the napkins with the frayed hems and began. There was a particular piece in this kind of work that Alina could not fully explain to anyone who had not experienced it. It was not excitement. It was not the sharp engagement of solving a difficult problem. It was something quieter and more steady. The rhythm of needle and thread, the small precise movements of her fingers, the visible progress of a broken thing becoming whole again under her hands. The world outside the window could be whatever it needed to be. In here there was only the cloth and the light and the work. She was halfway through the second napkin when she heard steps in the corridor outside. Not Mrs. Colby's steps, which were brisk and purposeful and always slightly hurried. These were slower. They paused outside the door, then they moved on. She kept her eyes on her work. She finished the second napkin and started the third. She was nearly done with the third when the door opened. She looked up without alarm because she was not the kind of person who startled easily, and because she had been expecting someone to check on her at some point during the morning, and because some part of her, the part she had been carefully not listening to since breakfast, had formed a small, quiet expectation. It was not Mrs. Colby. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table and then at her. He looked at the stack of mended napkins to her left and the remaining work to her right. He looked at her face. She looked at his and waited. He said he had come to see if the room had everything she needed. She said it had everything and more, and that she hoped he did not mind her working on the napkins because they had been sitting there waiting and she had the time. He said he did not mind in the least. He stepped into the room and looked at the mended hems and then picked one of the napkins up and examined the stitching. He turned the fabric over and looked at the back. Alina watched him do it. She knew what he was doing. He was checking the quality of the work, the way you check the work of someone whose skill you are genuinely curious about. He set the napkin down. He said it was excellent. She said thank you. He asked if she had always been this precise. She said her mother had refused to pass any piece of work until it was perfect, and that the standard had become simply how she did things. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window and not at her, and there was something in his face that she could not fully interpret, not the earlier blankness, something with slightly more weight to it. He said that it was a good thing to have been given a high standard. She said that it was, though she had not always thought so at the time. He looked at her then with something that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of a smile. It did not complete itself, but it was there for a moment and she saw it. He said he would not keep her from her work. He said the rider had been sighted on the northern road, and the wheel part should arrive within the hour. She should be able to depart by 2 or half past at the latest. She thanked him. He said she was welcome. He left. She sat for a moment without picking up her needle. She looked at the window. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt at the edges where the sun had reached the grass, and small bright drops of water were forming along the lower branches of the nearest tree. She thought about what Mrs. Colby had said at breakfast about Alina's kindness to Flora. She thought about what the man in the brown coat had said, that the Duke never ordinarily made such offers to delayed guests. She thought about the way he had looked at her work, as though seeing it mattered to him. She thought about all of this carefully, the way she thought about everything, and then she decided that she was reading too much into things that had simple explanations. He was a man of considerable means and position who ran a well-ordered household and was simply being considerate toward an inconvenienced traveler. That was all. She picked up her needle and began the last piece of mending. She told herself that was all. In the entrance hall downstairs, Flora appeared again, this time with Ruth firmly holding her hand and permission clearly given, and asked Mrs. Colby in a very serious voice if the lady with the locket was still in the house. Mrs. Colby said she believed the lady was still in the house for a few more hours. Flora asked if she could go and see her. Mrs. Colby thought about this and then said that they would ask. In the small workroom off the east wing, Alina had put down her needle and was looking at the window again. watching a single bright drop of water move down a branch and fall, and she was not thinking about Aldgate Street at all. The workroom door opened a second time that morning and Alina turned expecting Edmund, but it was Flora. The child stood in the doorway in her daytime clothes now, a small dark dress with a white collar and sturdy shoes, with Ruth hovering behind her in the corridor. Flora's expression was one of deliberate seriousness, the kind a 4-year-old adopts when she wants very much to be taken seriously and is aware that this does not always happen automatically. Alina put down her needle and gave Flora her full attention. Flora walked into the room with purpose. She stopped beside the table and looked at the napkins and then at Alina and said, in the considered tone of someone who has prepared what they wish to say, that she had wanted to say thank you. Alina asked what she was thanking her for. Flora said for last night, when she had been frightened and Alina had held her shoulders and spoken to her calmly and found Ruth for her. She said Ruth had told her it was the polite thing to do, to thank someone properly, and that she agreed with Ruth. Alina said that she was very pleased Flora had come to say so, and that she was welcome. Flora then looked at the locket at Alina's neck. She looked at it for a long moment with the open curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. Alina unclasped the locket and opened it and held it out. Flora leaned close. She studied the tiny painted face inside. She asked who it was. Alina said it was her mother. Flora asked where her mother was. Alina said that her mother had died 4 years ago and that she lived in heaven now, which was the answer she gave when she did not have the energy to engage with the larger and unanswerable question, and because it was what her own mother had told her when her grandmother died, and some comforts, once given, deserved to be passed on. Flora thought about this, then she said with great directness that her own mother had also died. The room was very quiet. Ruth made a small sound from the doorway, the soft sound of someone who has heard this said before and still finds it difficult each time. Alina looked at Flora steadily. She did not rush to fill the quiet with reassurance. She simply looked at the child and let her be in the truth of what she had said. Then Alina said that was a very hard thing. She said she was sorry for it. Flora nodded. She said it was all right. Then she said that her father was very sad sometimes and that he looked out the window for a long time without saying anything, and that she did not always know what to do when he was like that. Alina thought about the tall man in the dark clothes who had stood in the corridor the previous evening and had come to the workroom that morning to look at her mended stitching. She thought about the way he had looked at the window in this room, not at her, when he said that it was a good thing to have been given a high standard. She understood now the weight she had seen in his face. She told Flora carefully that sometimes when people are sad, the best thing a person can do is simply be nearby. Not to fix the sadness or to talk a great deal, but just to be there and to be steady, and to let the person know that someone is close. Flora considered this with visible concentration. Then she said that she sometimes sat on the step outside his study and knocked on the door and told him what she had done that day, and that he always opened the door. Alina said that sounded exactly right. Flora looked satisfied with this verdict. Then she asked, with a sudden shift of topic that was entirely characteristic of 4-year-olds, if Alina would like to see the garden before she left. Alina looked at the remaining work on the table, 2 more napkins, 40 minutes at most. She said she would very much like to see the garden when she had finished her work, if Ruth could arrange it. Flora looked at Ruth. Ruth said she thought that could be arranged. Flora turned back to Alina and said she would come back when she was ready, and then she walked out of the room with the same purposeful dignity with which she had entered it. Ruth followed, sending a brief look at Alina that contained more warmth than any words she might have said. Alina sat alone in the workroom again. She picked up her needle. She pulled the thread through the cloth. She thought about a child sitting on a step outside a study door and knocking and telling her father what she had done that day. She thought about a man opening the door every time. She finished the last 2 napkins in silence, working with more care than they strictly required, because the care was the way she thought, and she needed to think. When she was done, she stacked all the napkins neatly and placed the sewing things back in the basket and put on her coat and went to find Flora. The garden was cold and bright by the late morning, the frost now fully melted and the stone paths damp and dark. Flora walked beside Elena at a pace that required Elena to shorten her own stride considerably, which she did without thinking about it. Ruth walked behind them at a respectful distance. Flora showed Elena the rose bed, which she explained very earnestly was sleeping and would wake up in spring. She showed Elena the stone bench and said that her father sometimes sat there in the evening with a book, though he usually did not read much of it. She showed Elena the section of path where the flagstones were uneven, and said she had once tripped on them and grazed her knee, and had tried very hard not to cry because her father looked so worried when she was hurt that it made her want to cry more. Elena listened to all of it. They came around a corner of the hedge and nearly walked directly into Edmund Ashford. He stopped, they all stopped. For a moment nobody said anything. Flora said with complete composure that she was showing Elena the garden. He looked at Elena, she looked at him. Neither of them had arranged this encounter and neither of them pretended otherwise. He fell into step beside them without being asked. Flora, apparently finding this entirely natural, continued her tour of the garden. She pointed out the place where the robin came every morning. She pointed out the fountain, which was not running because of the cold. She said when she was bigger she would ask for a cat, and she had already decided it would be an orange one. Edmund listened to his daughter with an expression that Elena could now read, or was beginning to. It was not the blankness she had seen in the entrance hall. It was something older and quieter, a love that had been living alongside a grief for long enough that the two had become inseparable. Elena had felt something similar. She recognized it the way you recognize the climate of a country you have visited before. They reached the far end of the garden near the dormant rose bed, and Flora discovered a small snail on the stone wall and became entirely absorbed in examining it. Ruth stayed close to her. Elena stood a few steps away. After a moment, Edmund came to stand beside her. They were both looking at the garden. He said quietly that Flora had not taken to a stranger so quickly since she was very small. Elena said nothing, she was listening. He said that the past 2 years had been difficult for her, that she was adaptable in the ways children sometimes are, that she asked fewer difficult questions than he sometimes feared she would, but that he was aware she carried more than a child her age should have to carry. Elena said that Flora seemed to him quite clearly. He turned and looked at her. She did not look away. She said that the child watched him with a great deal of attention and wanted to know what to do when he was sad, not because she was worried exactly, but because she cared about him and caring required some kind of action, and she was still small enough that she had not found the right one yet. He was very still. He said he had not thought about it in those terms. She said she had not meant to presume, she was only saying what she had observed. He said, after a moment, that she need not apologize for saying something true. They stood in the cold garden with the bare rose stems in front of them, and the snail receiving Flora's scientific attention behind them, and the sky above them moved from gray to a pale, washed blue the way it sometimes does in late morning, as though the day has reconsidered its earlier decision to be overcast. He asked, still looking at the garden, how long she had been alone. She understood immediately what he meant, not physically alone but in the way that matters more, without a person who was hers. She said 4 years. He said he was sorry for her loss. She said she was sorry for his. They stood together without speaking for a little while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have been honest with each other and have found in the honesty something they were not expecting and are not yet sure what to do with. Flora looked up from the snail and said, to no one in particular, that the snail's name was going to be Henry. Edmund looked at his daughter. Elena looked at him, looking at his daughter. And in the moment before he glanced back toward her, she saw his face do the thing she had not seen it do yet. It opened, very briefly, into something unguarded and entirely genuine, a warmth that was not performed and not careful, just real, the way a person's face is real when they have forgotten, for just a moment, to hold it in. She looked away before he turned back. She was not sure why. She looked at Henry the snail and told Flora it was a very good name. The rider arrived with the wheel part at 11:30. The repair took less time than expected. By 1 o'clock, the coachman came to the house and said the coach was ready and the passengers could depart whenever they wished. The other passengers gathered themselves quickly, relieved to be moving again after a night and a morning of enforced stillness. Elena went upstairs to her room and collected her satchel. She folded the white linen carefully and smoothed the coverlet and placed the used towels beside the washstand. She looked around the room once to make sure she had left it as she had found it. She looked at the window. The garden was visible below. The stone bench was empty now. The path was empty. The garden lay quietly in the pale blue morning, bare and structured and honest. She went downstairs. Mrs. Colby was in the entrance hall with a small wrapped parcel which she pressed into Eleanor's hands and said was some bread and cheese for the journey, because Harrogate was still 2 hours away and the coachman would not stop again if he could help it. Eleanor thanked her and meant it. Flora was there too, with Ruth. She had been brought down to say goodbye, and she stood very straight and formal and said goodbye Eleanor in a clear voice, and then immediately hugged Eleanor around the middle with her arms and held on for a moment before letting go and stepping back and resuming her formality. Eleanor said goodbye, Flora, and that Henry the snail was fortunate to have such a careful observer. Flora said she would check on him every day. Eleanor said she had no doubt. She picked up her satchel. She turned toward the door. He was standing at the far end of the entrance hall. She had not seen him come in. He was simply there, as he had been simply there the evening before in the corridor, as though he moved through his own house without making a particular production of it. She walked toward the door and he was in her path, not blocking it, just present. She stopped. He said he hoped the remainder of the journey was without incident. She said she hoped so too. He said he hoped she found what she was looking for in Harrogate. It was an ordinary thing to say, the kind of thing a host says to a departing guest, but there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less ordinary than it should have, and she was aware of this, and she was fairly certain he was too. She said thank you for the hospitality and the room and the workroom. He said it was nothing. She said it was not nothing. A brief pause. The other passengers were already moving through the door. The cold from outside was coming in around them. She held out her hand. He looked at it for just a moment, then he shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and she felt the warmth of it even through the cold of the entrance hall. She said goodbye. He said goodbye, Miss Voss. She walked out through the door and down the 2 stone steps, and along the gravel path toward the coach. She did not look back. She was not the kind of person who looked back. She climbed into the coach and sat near the window and arranged her satchel on her lap and looked straight ahead. The coachman closed the door, the horses shifted, the coach began to move. She did not look back at the house. She looked at the road ahead and the bare trees on either side and the pale sky above the tree line, and she thought, for the first time since she had set out that morning the previous day, about Charles and the textile house and the green sign on Oldgate Street. She thought about these things with considerable effort. The coach reached the end of the drive and turned onto the stone road, moving away from Dunmore Hall in the direction of Harrogate, and the house disappeared behind the trees, and the road stretched on ahead of them, clear and cold and certain. Eleanor pressed her fingers briefly against the locket at her throat. Then she put her hands in her lap and looked at the road, and did not think about the entrance hall or the garden or a small girl, saying the snail's name was Henry or a man standing at the far end of the hall, with an expression she was still not certain she had read correctly. She thought about none of it, and the coach carried her steadily away through the pale morning, toward the city that was waiting, toward the plan that had survived its interruption, toward the next chapter of a life that she had always assumed would be quiet and sensible and entirely her own. She had no reason to think it would be anything else. Not yet. The coach arrived in Harrogate at 2:15 in the afternoon. The city was large and moving and loud after the stillness of the countryside, and Eleanor watched it through the window with the attentive calm of someone storing impressions for later use. The streets were wider than Aldenmoor's single road and far more crowded, with carts and horses and people on foot moving in all directions in a complex weave that somehow did not result in constant collision. The buildings were tall and pressed together, and some of them had been painted, and some had not, and all of them were older than they looked from a distance. The coach stopped at the central station on Market Square, and the passengers climbed out into the noise and the cold. The woman who had worn the hat said a warm farewell to Eleanor and pressed her hand, and said she hoped things went well. The man in the brown coat was already looking for a cab and talking loudly to no one in particular about his schedule. The young couple from the front of the coach walked away arm in arm without looking back. Elinor stood on the pavement with her satchel and her coat and took one steady breath of Harrogate air, which smelled of coal smoke and bread and something sharp and industrial underneath, and oriented herself. Aldgate Street was on the east side of the market square according to the directions Charles had included in his letter. She found it without difficulty. It was a narrow street with commercial buildings on both sides, most of them ground-floor shops or offices with rooms above. She walked along it looking for the green sign. She did not find a green sign. She found instead a door painted the remains of green, flaking and faded, above which the words Aldgate Textile House were barely legible in paint so old it was nearly the same color as the wood beneath it. The door itself was locked. There was no light in the windows. There was a notice affixed to the door with 2 pins, written in a formal hand on cream paper that she had to step close to read. She read it. She read it again. The notice said that the Aldgate Textile House had ceased trading on the 14th of October, and that inquiries regarding outstanding accounts should be directed to the offices of Newton and Blake on Commercial Street. October, that was 4 months ago. Elinor stood on the pavement in front of the dark door and the faded green sign and the notice in its formal hand, and she felt the particular quality of silence that arrives when a plan does not just change, but ends entirely. She did not cry. She was not prone to crying in public, or in most private circumstances either. Crying was something she did rarely and with a sense that it should be done properly, in a suitable location, with time afterward to recover before facing anything further. This was not a suitable location. She turned and walked back to Market Square and sat on a bench near the fountain, which was also not running because of the cold, and she took out Charles's letter from the inner pocket of her satchel where she had carried it since she received it, and she read it again. It was dated 3 months ago. Everything in it had been presented as current, as established, as waiting for her. The textile house, the fair wages, the clean lodgings. Charles had written as though all of it were entirely solid and certain, and she had believed him because he was her family and she had trusted him. And now she was sitting on a bench in a city she had never visited before with a satchel and 32 shillings and a letter that described a world that no longer existed. She folded the letter and put it back. She thought about what to do. She was practical by nature and by necessity, and practicality in a situation like this required a very clear-eyed inventory of what actually existed rather than what had been expected. What existed was her satchel, her coat, her mother's locket, and 32 shillings. She had her skills, which were genuine and marketable. She was in a city large enough to have more than one employer of seamstresses. She had the name of a legal office on Commercial Street, where she might be able to learn what had happened to Charles, because Charles himself appeared to have become as hard to find as the textile house. She stood up, she adjusted the strap of her satchel. She walked to Commercial Street and found the offices of Newton and Blake, which were above a stationer's shop and accessible by a narrow staircase. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink on his fingers who looked at her with the mild uncertainty of someone assessing whether she was a person whose business was worth his time. She told him she was inquiring about the Aldgate Textile House and her cousin who had worked there. The clerk said a moment and went through a door at the back. He came back with an older man who introduced himself as Mr. Blake, and who looked at her with a more careful kind of uncertainty. Mr. Blake said that the textile house had been closed following the departure of its proprietor, a Mr. Charles Vale, who had left the city in late September with debts that he had not settled, and whose whereabouts were currently unknown. He said this with the precision of a man who had said it before and had no particular feeling about it either way. Elinor said with equal precision that Charles Vale was her cousin and that he had written to her 3 months ago offering her a position at the textile house, and that she had traveled from Aldenmore today on the basis of that letter and found the door locked and the notice pinned to it. Mr. Blake looked at her. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience. She said she understood that he had not caused the inconvenience. He said she was quite right that he had not. A silence. She asked if he had any idea where Charles had gone. Mr. Blake said he did not, and that if she happened to find out she was welcome to let him know, as the question was of some professional interest. Elinor thanked him and went back down the narrow staircase to the street. She stood on Commercial Street in the cold afternoon light and performed another inventory. 32 shillings, skills, a city, no contact, no lodging, no arrangement of any kind. The 32 shillings would cover lodging for a short period, perhaps 10 days at a modest rate if she was careful, 10 days to find work. It was not a great deal of time, but it was not nothing either. She had worked with less. She found a lodging house on the south side of the market square that had a sign in the window advertising rooms by the week. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Dunbar, who was stout and businesslike and showed Alina a room on the second floor that was small and clean with a single window overlooking the yard. The price was 4 shillings a week, which included breakfast but nothing else. Alina said she would take it. She spent that first evening in the small room writing a precise list. Every textile shop or workshop in Harrogate that she knew of or could reasonably locate. Every household that might require a seamstress. The name of the charity that sometimes connected working women with domestic positions, which Mrs. Peel from Aldenmore had mentioned once, and which Alina had filed away in that quiet internal archive of useful information she had been building since childhood. She wrote the list by candlelight, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with a book under the paper for a firm surface, and when the list was finished, she read it once and put it away and lay down in her coat because the room was cold and the blanket was thin. She thought in the dark about what Mrs. Peel would say. Mrs. Peel would say that this was a setback and not a catastrophe, and that there was a difference and the difference mattered. Mrs. Peel would say that Alina had her hands and her skill and her sense, and that a person with those 3 things was not without resources. Alina thought this was probably true. She also thought, in the space between waking and sleeping where thoughts arrive unchecked, about a warm room with a south-facing window and a basket of thread, and the particular quality of the light through the glass in the late morning, about a garden with a dormant rose bed and bare stone paths, about a child who had named a snail Henry. She stopped that thought before it became anything more than a thought. She closed her eyes. In the morning she went to the first textile shop on her list, which was on Bridge Lane, and spoke to the proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, who looked at the sample of Alina's work that she had brought in her satchel and said she had no positions available currently, but that the quality was evident and she would keep Alina's name. The second shop on the list was closed on Mondays. The third was a small workshop behind the milliner's on Garnet Street, run by a man named Mr. Price, who made alterations and sold made-to-measure garments to a clientele who were not wealthy enough for the fine tailors on the high street, but who wanted better than ready-made. Mr. Price looked at Alina's sample for a long time. He said his current seamstress was leaving at the end of the month to care for her ailing mother. He said, if she came back in 4 days, he would be able to tell her whether he had decided. 4 days? She thanked him and left and walked back through the cold streets to Mrs. Dunbar's lodging house and sat in the small room and thought about 4 days. She had 24 shillings remaining after paying the week's lodging. 4 days was manageable if she was careful with food. She would not starve. She would not be comfortable, but comfortable was not what she needed. She needed employed. She went back out and spent the afternoon doing what she had always done when the world required her to wait for something she could not control. She worked. She went to the charity on Vine Street and offered her services 2 afternoons a week in exchange for 3 meals, which they accepted. She found a church notice board on the high street that listed households seeking domestic help and copied 2 addresses into the small notebook she carried. She spoke to Mrs. Dunbar's neighbor, who was a laundress, and arranged to help with the folding and pressing on Wednesday morning for a small sum. By the time the light failed, she had arranged enough work to cover her food and a portion of next week's lodging if Mr. Price's answer was no. She walked back to Market Square in the dusk. The city had shifted its mood, as cities do at the end of the working day, from the focused noise of commerce to the looser, warmer sound of people going home. Lights were coming on in the windows above the shops. A woman with a basket of bread was selling the day's last loaves at a reduced price, and Alina bought one and carried it under her arm. She stood for a moment in the square and looked at the city around her. It was not Aldenmore. It was not the quiet country morning or the frost-touched fields or the high pale walls of Dunmore Hall. It was loud and smoky and large, and she did not know it yet. But she was beginning to learn its streets, and she could learn the rest. She went back to Mrs. Dunbar's and ate bread and the cheese from the parcel Mrs. Colby had pressed into her hands the morning before, which she had not opened until now and which contained, in addition to the bread and cheese, a small square of ginger cake wrapped in a separate cloth. She looked at the ginger cake for a moment. She thought about a housekeeper who who had offered her the warmest room without being asked. She ate the cake slowly in the cold small room and found it was very good. 4 days later she went back to Mr. Price's workshop on Garnet Street and he offered her the position. The wages were modest but fair. The work would begin at the end of the month when his current seamstress departed. He said he could not pay her during the intervening 2 weeks, but he could give her piecework to take away, alterations that customers had brought in but that were backing up faster than one seamstress could manage. Elinor said she would take the piecework immediately and start the position at the end of the month. She walked back to Market Square with a paper parcel of alterations under her arm and 32 shillings still in her coat pocket, because the charity meals and the laundry work and the bread she had bought had cost her exactly what she had arranged them to cost, and she had not spent a penny more. She was employed, she had a room, she had a plan again, different from the first one but her own and built on what was actually real. She was not entirely at ease. The city still felt large and unfamiliar, and there was no Mrs. Peel next door and no neighbor who knew her name. But ease was not what she had come for. She had come for something solid, and solid was what she was building. She sat down on the bench near the fountain and opened the parcel of piecework and looked at the first garment. It was a woman's coat, dark blue, with a torn lining and a missing button. Elinor turned it over in her hands. The fabric was good quality, better than she usually worked with. Someone had loved this coat. She looked at the lining. The tear was clean, not frayed, which meant it was recent and accidental rather than long-standing neglect. She could repair this. She would do it well, and she would charge the fair price for it, and Mr. Price would see what she was capable of, and that would be the beginning. She folded the coat back up carefully. Across the square, a cart horse stood perfectly still while its driver unhitched it, patient and untroubled by the noise around it. Elinor watched the horse for a moment. Then she picked up her parcel and her satchel and stood up and walked back toward Mrs. Dunbar's. She did not think about Dunmore Hall. She had decided not to think about it, and she was carrying out that decision with her usual commitment. The fact that she was carrying it out with more effort than most of her decisions required was something she did not examine too closely. The coat with the torn lining sat on the table in her small room that night, and she worked on it by candlelight until her eyes grew tired. And when she was done, she held it up in the light and looked at the seam, and it was perfect, as her work always was, and she folded it and put it with the others and blew out the candle. She lay in the dark. She thought about the coat's owner, whoever she was, and whether she knew yet that it had been mended. She thought about a man looking at the back of a mended napkin and saying it was excellent. She stopped. She closed her eyes. She slept. Elinor had been working at Mr. Price's workshop on Garnet Street for 3 weeks when she discovered that word traveled faster in Harrogate than she had expected. It began with a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who collected her altered skirt on a Tuesday morning and said to Mr. Price that whoever had done the work had the finest hand she had encountered in this city or any other, and she would be back. She was back within the week with a coat, and then with a dress that needed restructuring at the waist, and each time she told someone else. The third time she came, she brought a friend called Mrs. Elwood, who brought her own armful of garments and stayed to talk while Elinor measured and pinned. Mr. Price watched this development with the expression of a practical man who is witnessing something good happen to his business and is trying not to show that he is surprised. Elinor simply worked. The workshop was small and organized, 2 fitting rooms at the back separated from the main workroom by a curtain, a front counter where Mr. Price handled customers, and the central space where Elinor spent her days at the long table with the north window above it. She kept the table exactly as she liked it. Tools on the left, current work in the center, finished pieces on the right, nothing out of place. Mr. Price had commented once in the first week that she kept a neater bench than anyone who had worked for him before. She had said she found it easier to work when she could see everything clearly. He had nodded and not mentioned it again. She liked Mr. Price. He was fair and businesslike and did not require conversation beyond what was professionally necessary, which suited her. He paid on time, and he did not interfere with how she did her work, and he turned away customers who were rude to her, which he had done twice in the first fortnight in a quiet and absolute way that she had noticed and respected. She was settled. She was not yet comfortable because Harrogate was still a foreign landscape, and she did not yet have the kind of familiarity with it that builds over months and years into something that feels like belonging. But she was settled. She had a routine. She knew which baker opened earliest on Thursdays, she knew the shortcut through the alley behind Vine Street, she knew which table at the corner coffee house was warmest in the afternoon. These were small things, but they were the building blocks of a life, and she was assembling them carefully. On the last Thursday of her third week at Mr. Price's, a letter arrived for her at Mrs. Dunbar's. She was not expecting a letter. She had written to 2 people since arriving in Harrogate, one letter to Mrs. Peel to say she had arrived safely and found work, and one to the solicitor in Aldenmore handling the sale of her mother's house to confirm that the final payment had been received. Neither had replied yet, and she was not expecting them to for another few days. This letter had a different kind of seal on it, not the plain wax of an ordinary correspondence but a proper stamp, circular, with a crest she did not recognize. She sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. It was not long. It was written in a clear, measured hand that moved without decoration across the page, saying what it meant to say without excess. It said that the writer hoped she had arrived safely in Harrogate and that the remainder of the journey had been uneventful. It said that Flora had asked after her twice in the week following her departure, and that Henry the snail had been found 3 days later at a slightly different point on the same wall, which Flora had taken as evidence of his good health and independent spirit. It said that the mended napkins had been noticed by Mrs. Colby and remarked upon, and that the workroom had been used by no one since. It said that if she found herself ever in need of anything, she should not hesitate to write. It was signed simply, Edmund Ashford. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands. She read it twice. She was aware that her heart was doing something it was not supposed to be doing, a kind of quiet and inconvenient lift, the sort of response a sensible person trains themselves out of early in life because it leads to complications. She was a sensible person. She had always been a sensible person. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her satchel, next to Charles's letter, which she had kept not for sentiment, but as a practical reminder of what happens when a person builds plans on things that have not been verified. She did not think about what it meant that a duke had sat down and written her a letter about a snail. She thought about it for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she was setting a sleeve, and while she was steaming a collar, and while she was walking home in the early dark with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She thought about it while she was eating her supper of soup and bread at Mrs. Dunbar's kitchen table, while Mrs. Dunbar talked about her daughter in Bristol. She thought about it lying in bed in the dark, which was where the honest thinking happened, whether she invited it or not. He had written to her, not because there was any practical reason to write to her, not because she had asked for anything or left anything unresolved. He had written to tell her that a child had asked after her and that a snail had moved 3 inches in a week, and that the room she had worked in was unchanged. He had found a reason to send a letter. She was not naive. She had lived 24 years in the world, and she knew very well the weight of things that were said not because they needed to be said, but because saying them was the only means available to a person of placing themselves, briefly, in the presence of someone they did not want to have simply gone away. She knew the weight of it, she was feeling it. She also knew all the distances, the distance of 12 miles between Harrogate and Dunmore Hall, the distance between a seamstress from Aldenmore and a duke with an estate that had its own lake, the distance between a letter that said nothing improper and anything that might come after. She told herself these distances were very large. She told herself that she was not going to write back, that the kind and sensible response was to let the letter be what it appeared to be, a generous and courteous gesture from a host, and to leave it at that. She told herself this for 4 days. On the 5th day she bought paper from the stationer's on Commercial Street, and sat down at the small table in her room and wrote a reply. She told him that she had arrived safely and found the situation with the textile house resolved, which was technically accurate if brief. She told him she was working at a workshop on Garnet Street, and that Harrogate was a larger and louder city than she had expected, but that she was learning it gradually. She told him she was glad to hear about Henry the snail's continued health. She told him that Flora was a remarkable child, and that she thought about their conversation in the garden sometimes. She stopped there, she read what she had written. She crossed out the last sentence. Then she looked at the crossing out and thought about whether crossing it out was more revealing than leaving it in. She left it out. She wrote instead that she was grateful for the hospitality of the estate and for his letter, and that she hoped the household was well. She signed it Elinor Voss. She sealed it and addressed it, and posted it that same morning before she could reconsider. Then she walked to the workshop on Garnet Street and sat down at the long table under the north window and picked up a needle and worked very steadily for the rest of the day, and did not think about what she had written, or what she had crossed out, or what either thing meant. Mrs. Hartley came in at midday with a dress that needed taking in at the sides, and stayed for 20 minutes talking about the upcoming season of events in Harrogate, a charitable dinner, and a series of musical performances, and something called the Spring Exhibition at the Guildhall. She said it was a great pity that Elinor had not arrived in time for the winter ball at the Aldgate Rooms, which had been the social event of the last several months. Elinor said she did not attend balls as a rule. Mrs. Hartley said that was a great waste, if she did not mind her saying so. Elinor did not mind, but she did not agree either. After Mrs. Hartley left, Mr. Price came through from the front counter with a cup of tea and left it on the end of Elinor's table without comment, the way he sometimes did when it was cold, and he had made himself one and thought she might want one too. She looked at the cup. She looked at the workshop around her, the window and the table and the fitting rooms and the door to the front counter and the sounds of the street outside and the smell of fabric and the tools arranged on her left and the work in front of her. She thought, this is mine now, this is what I have built, it is small and it is real and it belongs to me. She picked up her needle and her tea and she worked. The reply to her letter arrived 10 days later. It was longer than the first one. It told her about an unexpected late frost that had damaged part of the garden and the efforts to protect what could be protected. It told her that Flora had developed a new interest in beetles, and that Ruth was finding this a more complicated enthusiasm to manage than the snail. It said one or two things about an estate matter he was dealing with that were interesting to him, and that he found he wished to share with someone who would find them interesting in return. That last phrase sat in her mind for a long time. She wrote back, he wrote back. It became, without either of them calling it what it was, a correspondence. The letters arrived every 10 days or so, sometimes 2 weeks apart, once only a week. They grew neither shorter nor longer, but they deepened, the way a conversation deepens when the people having it have stopped performing for each other and are simply talking. He told her about the estate and the tenants and the decisions that landed on his desk. She told him about the workshop and the garments and the customers and what she was learning about the city. He told her about his attempts to read more in the evenings and the books he had chosen and abandoned and occasionally finished. She told him about the coffee house table in the afternoon and the baker on Thursdays and the shortcut through the alley that had saved her 10 minutes every day. She told him about the small things, the real things. So did he. She noticed this. She noticed it with the part of her that noticed everything and stored it in that quiet internal archive. She noticed that a man who had every reason and opportunity to be large in his communications was instead choosing to be small and real and specific. She noticed that he always asked questions and waited for the answers. She noticed that he told her about Flora with a care that was not performance, the way people sometimes perform their love for their children, but was simply love, stated plainly. She noticed all of it. She sat one evening at the small table in her room with one of his letters open in front of her and the window dark behind her and the candle burning low, and she held very still for a moment and let herself look at what was in front of her, clearly, and without the careful management she usually applied to things that were complicated. What was in front of her was a correspondence with a man she had met for less than 24 hours who had not said a single word to her that was improper or forward or outside the bounds of respectful friendship, and who had nonetheless made her feel, in the reading of every letter, the way she had felt in the garden at Dunmore Hall when the sky had shifted from grey to pale blue, and a child was naming a snail, and he had looked at his daughter with his whole unguarded face. Like something was possible. She had not felt that in a long time. She folded the letter and put it in the growing stack in the inner pocket of her satchel, layered above the locket and below Charles's letter, which had been demoted to the very bottom where it belonged. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and began the next reply, and wrote more than she had intended to, and sent it before the caution could catch up with the honesty. Spring was coming. She could feel it at the edges of the days, in the slightly later darkness and the slightly warmer afternoons, and the birds that had appeared in the yard behind Mrs. Dunbar's house in the past week, with the particular purposeful busyness of creatures who know the season has shifted and have a great deal to accomplish. Harrogate was changing around her too, loosening from winter into something lighter. The market square had more color in it, the flower sellers returning to their corners, the coffee-house tables moving outside on the fine days. Eleanor's route to work had changed with the weather. She took the longer way now because the longer way went along the river, and the river in early spring was alive in a way that she had not expected and liked more than she could easily explain. She was busy, the workshop was growing. Mr. Price had said the previous week that he was considering whether they needed to take on another person to manage the volume, and that this was a situation entirely attributable to her, and that she should know that. She had said she was glad to hear it. She was busy and she was settled, and she was doing what she was good at, and the city was becoming familiar around her. And still, every 10 days or so, a letter arrived with a seal she now recognized immediately, and she carried it upstairs before opening it, and she read it with complete attention, and she wrote back. She did not examine this too carefully. She was, she told herself, simply being a good correspondent. She said this to herself with a straight face and absolute conviction. The birds in Mrs. Dunbar's yard disagreed with the assessment and made their opinions known at length each morning, but Eleanor was sensible about birds and did not take their counsel. The morning the letter came that was different from all the others. Eleanor was in the middle of repairing a set of curtains that had been brought in rolled up in a cart and smelled faintly of camphor. They were heavy damask in a deep red that had faded at the folds, and the repair required matching thread from a specific lot that Mr. Price had had to order specially. She was threading the needle for the third time when she heard the bell above the front door and Mr. Price's voice, and then a pause, and then Mr. Price appearing at the workroom curtain holding an envelope. He said it had been hand-delivered. She looked at the seal, then she looked at Mr. Price. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has not asked a question but is waiting for information that he suspects is interesting. She took the envelope and set it on the table. She finished threading the needle. She began the first stitch of the repair. Mr. Price waited another moment and then went back to the front counter. She worked for another 20 minutes. Then she set down the needle, picked up the envelope and opened it. It was hand-delivered because he was in Harrogate. He had written that he had come to the city on a matter of estate business, and that if it were convenient, he would be glad to call on her at the workshop, or alternatively to meet her at a location of her choosing at a time of her choosing, and that he understood entirely if this was not possible or welcome, and that he would not impose. He had written the words "if this is not possible or welcome" twice, as though he had written the sentence once, and then felt it needed to be said again with greater weight, to make clear that the offer of it was genuine, and that it would be accepted either way. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands for longer than usual. She looked at the curtain, she looked at the needle waiting in the cloth. She thought about all the letters she had written and received over the past 2 months, and what they had become and what she had decided, each time she wrote back not to examine too carefully. She thought about distances. She thought about them quite deliberately and quite clearly, the way a person thinks about something they have been circling for a long time and have finally decided to face. Then she put the letter down and went to find Mr. Price and told him she would need an hour in the early afternoon and asked if that was possible. He said it was entirely possible and to take however long she needed, and he said it with a tone that suggested he had been in possession of certain suspicions that were now being confirmed. She wrote a brief note and had it sent to the address he had included in the letter, naming the coffee house on the corner of River Lane and the Market Square for 2 o'clock. She went back to the curtain and worked steadily for the rest of the morning. At 1:45, she washed her hands and put on her coat and walked through the spring afternoon to the corner of River Lane. He was already there when she arrived. He was sitting at an outdoor table with 2 cups already ordered, and he stood when he saw her coming, which was a gesture she had not expected, and which she acknowledged with a nod because acknowledgement was the appropriate response, and she was not in the habit of making more of gestures than they were. She sat down, he sat down. The coffees were hot, and the afternoon was mild enough to be pleasant outside, and the square was doing its spring business around them with the noise and the movement she had grown accustomed to over the past months. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She said it was a long way to come on estate business. He said the estate business was genuine. She said she did not doubt it. He said that it had occurred to him that there was other business too. She looked at him, the same direct, clear look she had given him across the dinner table on the night of her first arrival, the look with no flattery and no performance, just a person looking at another person and taking them as they were. He held it without flinching. He said that he had found the past 2 months, meaning the correspondence, to be the most genuinely interesting 2 months he had had in a very long time, and that this was something he had not planned to say, but that seemed, given the trouble of coming 12 miles, worth saying honestly. Elena was quiet for a moment. She said that she had found it interesting too. He said he was glad. She said she thought they should be clear about something. He said he was listening. She said that she was not a person who did things by halves or who said things she did not mean, and that she found correspondence and interest and genuine exchange entirely valuable and worth having. She said she also knew the distance between a seamstress from Aldenmore and a duke, and that she had no interest in pretending that distance did not exist, or in conducting herself as though it were simpler than it was. She said she was telling him this not because she assumed he did not know it, but because she preferred everything to be visible from the beginning. He looked at her steadily throughout all of this. When she was done, he said that he appreciated her saying it. Then he said that in his experience, the distances that appeared the largest in theory were often the ones that mattered the least in practice. He said that the distance he had felt most keenly in the past several years was the distance between a room full of people and someone worth actually talking to, and that this was not a distance measured in miles. He said this without drama or performance. He simply said it plainly, the way she respected. She looked at her coffee. Then she said that Flora had told her he opened the study door every time she knocked. He said yes. He said it was the most important door he owned. She looked at him. Something in her chest did the inconvenient thing again, the quiet lift, and this time she did not argue with it. She said that was the right answer. The afternoon was mild and the square was busy, and they sat at the corner table on River Lane for an hour and talked the way they had been talking in letters for 2 months, except that it was better because the letters had been very good, but this was the real thing, the actual voices and the actual faces and the small particular observations that only proximity allows. He noticed that she held her coffee cup with both hands the way he had noticed she held her tea on the first night in the drawing room. She noticed that when he listened to something that interested him, he grew very still, which was the opposite of most people, who move more when they are engaged. They talked about the garden which was coming back. They talked about Harrogate which she was coming to like. They talked about a book he had actually finished recently and another she had been reading in the evenings at Mrs. Dunbar's. They talked about Flora's beetle collection which had grown to 5 specimens, all named. They did not talk about what this was or where it was going. Neither of them was ready to put a name to it, and neither of them needed to, because the honest version of things does not need a name in order to exist. When Elena stood to go back to the workshop, he walked with her to the end of River Lane. They stopped at the corner. He said that he would be in Harrogate again in 3 weeks. He said it without asking if this was welcome, which she noticed, and then he said, catching himself, that he hoped that might be convenient. She said it would be. They stood on the corner for a moment with spring moving around them and the square doing its business and the river visible at the end of the lane, bright and cold in the afternoon light. He said goodbye, Elena. It was the first time he had used her given name without miss before it. She noticed it. She let it rest where it landed. She said goodbye, Edmund. She walked back to the workshop. She did not look back. She never looked back. But she was smiling before she reached the end of River Lane, a small and private smile that she would not have produced for anyone who was watching. And she was still smiling when she picked up her needle and returned to the curtain, and the smile did not entirely leave for the rest of the afternoon. Mr. Price looked at her once from the doorway of the front counter. He said nothing. He went back to his work, but there was a quality to his silence that was satisfied, the silence of a man who has suspected for some time what he was looking at and is pleased to have it confirmed. The curtain was finished by closing time. Elena folded it with great care and set it in its paper parcel, and wrote the customer's name on the outside in her clear hand. She put on her coat and picked up her satchel and said good night to Mr. Price. The evening was mild. She took the longer way home, the one along the river. The water was high from the recent rains, and it moved with a particular brightness in the early evening light, catching the sun in small broken pieces. She walked along the bank and thought, this time without managing the thought, about the garden at Dunmore Hall in winter and what it might look like in spring, when the rose bed woke up and the dormant stems put out their first reluctant green. She thought she would like to see it. She thought there was a reasonable chance that she would. She walked home along the river in the mild spring evening, and the water moved beside her, bright and cold, and entirely unaware of how much had changed since the morning. The agreement with Mr. Price about her hours was renegotiated on a Tuesday in early April, 3 weeks after the afternoon at the corner table on River Lane. Not because the work had declined, it had not, the volume had continued to grow steadily, but because Elena had received a request that required an honest conversation. The request had come from Dunmore Hall. Not a letter this time, but a formal note on estate paper, written by Mrs. Colby in her housekeeper's precise hand, stating that several of the estate's ceremonial garments and table linens required the attention of a skilled seamstress, that the work was substantial and would require several days on site, and asking whether Miss Voss might be available to take on the commission at a rate that was considerably more than she was currently earning per week at Mr. Price's. Elena had read the note twice. Then she had sat with it for an evening. Then she had gone to Mr. Price in the morning and told him the truth, because the truth was simpler than any other version. She told him she had been asked to do restoration work at Dunmore Hall for several days, that it was a significant commission, and that she wanted to discuss how to handle the time away from the workshop without inconveniencing the customers who were relying on her. Mr. Price listened. He said he had been considering taking on a part-time helper for overflow work, and that this might be the moment to do so. He said Elena should take the commission, and he would manage the workshop. He said it in the tone of a man who knows considerably more about a situation than he has been directly told, and is choosing to simply deal with it practically. Elena appreciated this extremely. She wrote to Mrs. Colby accepting the commission. She wrote the letter at the small table in her room in the evening with the curtain open, and the spring night coming in through the gap at the top of the window, carrying the smell of the river and something green and uncertain that might have been early grass. She did not write a second letter to anyone else. She did not need to. The commission was a commission, and the arrangements were the arrangements, and everything else was a separate matter that existed in a separate part of the correspondence and would continue to exist there until it became something else. She was not certain when that would be. She was not uncertain either. She was, for the first time in a long time, in the position of a person who can afford to be patient because they are already in possession of something worth waiting for. She left for Dunmore Hall on a Thursday, on the early coach, with her satchel and her work-bag and her thread case, which was a narrow leather case that had been her mother's and contained 48 colors of thread arranged in order from lightest to darkest, and was the most valuable thing she owned apart from the locket. The coach did not break down this time. The road was dry and the horses were good, and the journey took 2 hours, and she arrived at the estate gate in the late morning with considerably less drama than the first time. Peter, the groom, was not at the gate, but one of the stable hands came out to meet her and carried her bags to the house. Mrs. Colby met her at the door and showed her in with the same careful politeness she had shown the stranded passengers in October, but with something warmer underneath it now, a familiarity that had not existed the first time. She showed Elena to the same guest room she had been given in October, the same east corridor room with the warmest fireplace. Elena looked at the bed with the lavender linen and the window with the view of the garden and did not say anything, but she felt something that was quiet and deep and not easily named, which was the feeling of a place that has become particular to a person without their having entirely decided that it would. She unpacked her work things and went to find the garments. They were in a large press at the back of the linen room, ceremonial tablecloths and altar cloths, and a set of formal household livery that had not been used in several years and showed it. There was also a collection of what appeared to be christening garments in a separate box, small and white and very old, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at the corners when she lifted it. She looked at all of it carefully, the way a doctor might look at a patient before forming a judgment, considering everything she saw before deciding anything. The tablecloths were restorable, the livery was more complicated and would take longer. The christening garments were the most delicate thing she had ever been asked to work on, and she said as much to Mrs. Colby, who had stayed while she examined them. Mrs. Colby said she knew. She said they had been in the family for 4 generations, and that the previous housekeeper had been reluctant to have them touched at all, but that the new master had said they should be brought back to proper condition so they could be used again when the time came. Elinor thought about this phrase, when the time came. She said she would be very careful. Mrs. Colby said she had no doubt of that. She began with the tablecloths, because they were the most straightforward, and because it was good to begin with something she was certain of while she was still settling into the work and the surroundings. The linen room had good daylight, and she set up her tools on the long table and worked through the morning with the particular focused peace she always found in this kind of work. At noon a housemaid brought her lunch on a tray, which she ate at the end of the work table, and at noon she heard steps in the corridor. She recognized them. She kept working. He knocked on the door, which was open, and said her name in the way he had adopted in the letters without the miss, which still felt new enough to notice. She looked up. He was in the doorway in the plain dark clothes she had come to associate with him as entirely characteristic, as though the position he held were something he wore separately from how he simply dressed when he was just himself. He looked at the table and the work laid out on it. He said he hoped the commission was manageable. She said it was very manageable and she was glad to have it. He asked if the room was adequate. She said it was more than adequate. He said he was glad. A pause, not an uncomfortable one. She asked how Flora was. His face did the thing it always did when she asked about Flora, the thing she had come to expect and to look for. It opened. He said Flora was well and had been told that Elinor was coming and had spent the previous 2 days reminding everyone in the house at intervals. He said Flora was also in the process of writing what she described as a list of important things to show Elinor, which she had not yet allowed him to see. Elinor said she looked forward to the list. He said Flora would be very glad to hear it. Then he said more quietly that it was good to see her here. He said it in the plain way he said everything that mattered without inflation. She looked at him, she let the look say what she meant, which was that it was good to be here. She did not say it out loud, she did not need to. They had been learning each other's way of saying things for long enough that the unsaid version landed exactly where it was meant to. He said he would leave her to work. He said dinner was at 7 if she wished to join them. She said she would. He left. She sat for a moment with her needle in her hand, and the tablecloth in front of her and the linen room around her, quiet and full of daylight. Then she bent over the cloth and made the next stitch. The days at Dunmore Hall settled into a rhythm that was different from the workshop rhythm but equally absorbing. Mornings in the linen room with the careful work, the slow restoration of things that had been neglected and were now being returned to themselves. Afternoons in the garden with Flora, who appeared at the linen room door at 1:30 each day with the reliable precision of a small person who has made a plan and intends to keep to it. Evenings at the dining table, with the household quiet and warm and very different from the formal dinner with the stranded passengers that first night. Flora's list of important things was long and detailed and included the rose bed, which had indeed woken up and was producing small red-green shoots at the ends of the canes, the spot on the south wall where a pair of birds had been building a nest for 2 weeks, the 5 beetles in their individual boxes, each with a label Flora had written herself in letters that were more determined than legible, the fountain which was running now, and the stone bench where, Flora said with the authority of personal observation, her father sometimes sat reading in the late afternoon when he had finished his work. Elinor looked at the stone bench and thought of October, of standing in the garden in the cold and the pale light, and hearing a man say it is a good thing to have been given a high standard. She thought about how much had been built since then, and how quietly. On the 4th evening she was sitting in the chair by the fire in the east corridor room after dinner with her book, which she was actually reading, and the house was quiet around her. There was a knock at the door. She said, "Come in." He came in and stood near the door, which he left open behind him, with the propriety of a man who is very aware of how things appear and what impression he is giving, and what he is saying in each choice. She looked at him. He said he hoped he was not disturbing her. She said he was not. He said he had been thinking about something, and had decided to say it because he had found that not saying things he meant to say was an inefficiency he was trying to reduce. She closed her book. He said that he did not know exactly when the correspondence had become what it had become, or when the commission at the estate had become more than a commission, or when the awareness of what he felt had become something he could no longer reasonably pretend was simply professional interest in a skilled seamstress from Aldenmore. He said he was not going to pretend any of these things now, because she had told him at the table on River Lane that she preferred things to be visible from the beginning, and he had agreed and intended to keep to that. He said that he was not asking her for anything tonight. He was saying what was true, and the thing that was true was that over the past several months she had become a person he could not imagine not having in his life, and he thought she ought to know that. The fire crackled. Outside the window the garden was dark and still. Elinor sat with her book in her lap and looked at him for a long moment. She let everything she had been careful about, all the distances she had measured, and all the management she had applied to her own responses, sit openly in her mind without organizing it. Then she said that she thought he ought to know the same thing in return. He was quiet. She said she did not know what came next, and she would not pretend she did, but she was not going to say that she felt nothing when she felt quite clearly the opposite. He looked at her with an expression she could read now. She had learned it over months of letters and one afternoon on River Lane and 4 evenings at the dining table and 4 days in the linen room. It was the expression of a man who had been guarded for a long time and was, piece by piece, laying the guard down. He said, "Good night, Elinor." She said, "Good night, Edmund." He went. The door remained open until he pulled it gently closed behind him. She sat in the chair by the fire for a long time after that, not thinking exactly. Just being in what was real, in the warm room with the lavender linen and the dark garden below the window and the quiet house around her, and the knowledge that something she had not planned and had not looked for had found her anyway, as the most significant things often do. She opened her book. She did not read a single word of it. She did not mind. It was not the estate that complicated things. It was the people outside of it. Elinor was back at the workshop on Garnet Street for 3 days before the first comment reached her. It came through Mrs. Hartley, who arrived for a fitting on a Wednesday morning with a manner that was slightly different from usual. Not unkind, but carrying something, the way a person carries news they are not sure how to deliver. She said, while Elinor was pinning the hem of a skirt, that she had heard Elinor had been up at Dunmore Hall for nearly a week on a commission. Elinor said that she had, and that it had been a significant job and gone well. Mrs. Hartley said yes, she had heard. Then she said, with the particular delicacy of a well-intentioned woman who is about to say something difficult, that she had also heard other things. Elinor waited. Mrs. Hartley said that there was some talk in certain parts of Harrogate about the nature of Elinor's connection to the Duke of Dunmore, and that the talk was not malicious exactly, but that it was there, and she thought Elinor ought to know about it. Elinor continued penning. She asked what kind of talk. Mrs. Hartley said the kind that people generate when a young woman of modest means spends several days at the estate of an unmarried duke. She said she was not repeating it to upset Elinor. She was repeating it because she liked Elinor and thought it was better to know than not to know. Elinor put in the last pin and straightened up. She said thank you for telling her. Mrs. Hartley said she hoped Elinor was all right. Elinor said she was perfectly all right. She was not perfectly all right. She was contained, which is not the same thing, but which is the available alternative when being perfectly all right is not yet possible. She finished the fitting and saw Mrs. Hartley out, and stood in the workroom for a moment after the front bell stopped ringing. Mr. Price appeared at the curtain. He looked at her face and said nothing. Then he said that there was tea made. She said thank you. They both drank their tea in the workroom without talking. It was the most helpful thing he could have done. She thought about the talk on her walk home that evening. She thought about it with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to any problem, assessing it honestly and without either dismissing it or allowing it to become larger than it was. The talk existed. It would continue to exist regardless of what she did, because this was how talk worked. It was generated by the collision of visible facts and people's assumptions, and it could not be stopped by anything except time and the replacement of assumption with knowledge. The visible facts were, she had been to the estate, she was corresponding with the Duke, she had met him for coffee on River Lane. None of these things were wrong or improper. All of them were open to interpretation by people who did not have the context and were inclined to fill the gap with whatever story suited them. She thought about what she had said to him at the table on River Lane, that she knew the distance and had no interest in pretending it was simpler than it was. She thought about what he had said in return. She wrote to him that evening. She told him about Mrs. Hartley and about what she had heard. She told him without anxiety or drama, because neither was warranted, but she told him because she had said she preferred everything to be visible, and because this was something he should know. His letter came back in 5 days. He said that he was aware of the talk. He said he had expected it and that expectation had not made it more welcome. He said he was sorry that she was facing it before any of it was resolved into something more concrete that could speak for itself. He said he did not intend to be deterred by it and hoped she did not either. He said that what he had said in the doorway of the East Corridor room was what he meant, and that what he meant was not a thing he had said lightly or planned to withdraw. He said he would like, if she was willing, to come to Harrogate next week and have a conversation that was not in a letter. Elena read this letter at the small table in her room with the spring evening at the window. She wrote back that she was willing. He came the following Thursday. They walked along the river, not at the coffee-house table this time but simply walking, because the afternoon was warm and the river was high and bright, and walking allowed for a kind of conversation that sitting did not, with spaces and movement, and the city going about its life on either side without paying them particular attention. He said he wanted to speak plainly, and she said she was glad of it. He said that what he felt for her was not a passing interest or a comfortable arrangement or anything that could be resolved by a different kind of attention. He said it had grown out of something real and had become real in its own right, and he did not know how to be dishonest about that even if he wanted to, which he did not. She walked beside him and listened. He said he knew the complications. He said he was not asking her to ignore them or to pretend they did not exist. He was asking her whether, knowing them, she was willing to continue. She said she had been willing since the letter about Henry the snail. He looked at her. She looked at the river. Then she said that she needed him to understand something about her, which was that she was not a woman who would become smaller in order to fit somewhere she was not expected to be. She said she had done things her own way all her life, and she intended to continue doing them her own way, and that if there were rooms and situations where she was not welcome because of where she had come from, she would manage that, but she would not manage it by pretending to be different from what she was. He said he would not want her to. She said she needed to believe that was true not just in this moment, but in the more complicated ones that would follow. He said, "Watch me then, over time, watch and see." She thought about that for a moment, then she said that was the right answer. They walked to the end of the river path where it turned into the open park, and they stood there for a moment with the water behind them and the city ahead. He said her name, just her name, nothing attached to it. She said yes. He said, was she certain? She said she was not uncertain, which was not quite the same thing, but was the most honest version of where she stood. He said that was enough for now. They walked back through the park in the mild spring afternoon, and the talk of Harrogate continued on all sides, not about them specifically in that moment, but about everything else that makes a city, and they walked through the middle of it like any two people taking the air by the river on a Thursday afternoon, and nothing about them announced itself, and that was exactly right. The complicated months that followed were in fact complicated, in the specific ways that she had known they would be. There were events she attended and rooms she entered where the reception was polite in the way that excludes rather than includes, and she encountered these with the same straight back and level gaze she had brought into the entrance hall of Dunmore Hall in October, when her dress was worn and she had 32 shillings, and she had not yet met anyone in the building. She had managed that entrance, she managed these too. There were also rooms where she was welcomed simply and genuinely, and people who met her and immediately set aside whatever preconceptions they had arrived with because she was simply herself in front of them, which was a quality people often found disarming when they had been expecting something more complicated. Through all of it she continued to work. She did not stop. She reduced her days at the workshop, but she did not leave, because the work was hers and she had built it, and she was not a person who abandoned the things she had built. Mr. Price had taken on the part-time helper, and the workshop was thriving, and she had a regular set of customers who asked for her specifically and came back without needing to be sought. She had her room at Mrs. Dunbar's and her river walk and her Thursday baker and her coffee house corner and her needle and thread, and the mother's locket and 32 shillings that had become rather more than 32 shillings. She had her own life. She was not giving it away, she was adding to it. And through all of this, the correspondence continued, and the Thursday walks continued, and the visits to Dunmore Hall continued, and Flora's beetle collection grew to 9, and Henry the snail was found again in November on a completely different wall, which was considered by everyone who knew of him to be an extraordinary feat of travel. And in the small room at Mrs. Dunbar's, in the evening, Eleanor sometimes sat by the window and looked at the dark city and thought about October and the cracked wheel and the cold road and a frightened child at the bottom of a staircase. And she thought about all the small things that had to happen in a particular order to bring a person from one place to another. She thought about her mother, the way she always did when she was somewhere she had not expected to be. She thought Alice would have found this particular series of events highly satisfying, because Alice had had a clear-eyed view of people and an appreciation for the kinds of stories that begin in the most ordinary ways and then become something else entirely without warning. Eleanor touched the locket at her throat. Then she went back to her book, or her work, or the letter she was writing, or the window and the dark city and the river she could hear from here on very quiet nights, moving through Harrogate the way rivers move through everything, without stopping, without looking back, entirely themselves. Eleanor had spent 12 years working with her hands, and she had learned that the most important repairs were often the ones no one could see. A perfect stitch disappeared into the fabric. A mended seam held so well that the garment appeared whole, as though it had never been otherwise. The work was in the invisibility of the work. She thought about this sometimes when she thought about the past year. Not the dramatic moments, because there had been very few of those. Not the scenes she might have written herself if she had been the kind of person who wrote scenes, the grand gestures and the declared feelings and the things said under chandeliers. That was not how it had happened. It had happened the way good work happened, steadily in small precise increments, each piece fitted carefully into the next, the whole becoming visible only when you stepped back from it and looked. It was a Thursday in early autumn, just over a year since the broken wheel on the stone road outside Dunmore Hall, when Edmund asked her a question while they were walking along the river. He asked it in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, the way people sometimes ask the most important things, slipping them in between the ordinary ones because the ordinary ones are a kind of preparation. They had been talking about Flora, who had begun formal lessons and was reportedly an excellent student of arithmetic and a less excellent student of sitting still. And then, without any transition, he stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. He said her name, then he said, "Will you marry me?" He did not dress it in anything. He did not arrive at it through a long formal speech or a prepared declaration. He said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered, and then he waited with the stillness he had when he was truly listening. Eleanor looked at the river. She had known this question was coming, not the exact moment, not the exact Thursday afternoon on the river path with the early autumn light on the water, but she had known the question was coming the same way you know certain things that have been building for a long time. She had not rehearsed her answer, because rehearsing felt dishonest, and she had learned that the honest answer was the one that arrived without rehearsal. She asked him one question in return. She asked whether he was asking because it was the right thing or because it was what he wanted. He said those two things were the same for him. She looked at him. She said yes. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said thank you. Not the thank you of performance or relief, but the thank you of a person receiving something they had hoped for and were glad of. She said she had one condition. He said he was listening. She said she was going to finish the commission she had taken on for the charity on Vine Street, which would take 3 more weeks, and she was going to give Mr. Price proper notice and help him find and train a replacement, and she was not going to be rushed through any of these things regardless of the social calendar. He said he would not dream of rushing her through any of them. She said good, then she said she had a second condition. He waited. She said Flora needed to know before anyone else. He said that had already been his intention. She said good again. They stood on the river path while the early autumn light moved on the water, and a pair of ducks made their way upstream with tremendous dignity and purpose, and the city continued on all sides without paying them any attention whatsoever. She put her hand in his. They walked back through the park. Flora took the news with the measured gravity of a 5-year-old receiving important information she has been, on some level, expecting for quite some time. She asked several careful questions. She asked if Elinor would live at Dunmore Hall. She asked if Elinor would still visit the Beetle collection. She asked if Elinor would still sometimes sit with her outside the study door. Elinor answered every question. Then Flora said, with complete solemnity, that she had known since the day Elinor fixed the napkins in the workroom that Elinor was going to stay, and that it had simply taken the adults quite a long time to arrive at the same conclusion. Edmund looked at his daughter. Elinor looked at Flora. Then Elinor said that Flora was absolutely right, and that she was very perceptive. Flora said she knew. The wedding was a private one, a small ceremony in the chapel at Dunmore Hall on a morning in early December. The chapel was cold, and the light came through the old glass windows in the colored fragments that stained everything they touched, the floor, the pews, the hands of the few people gathered there. Mrs. Colby was present, and Peter, and Mr. Price, who had come from Harrogate on the early coach and whose expression when he arrived was that of a man whose suspicions had, over a period of approximately 12 months, been entirely and satisfyingly confirmed. Flora stood between Ruth and her father, and wore her best dress and watched Elinor with the concentrated attention she brought to all things she considered important. Elinor wore a gown she had made herself. She had begun it 3 weeks after the conversation on the river path, in the evenings at Mrs. Dunbar's, working by candlelight after the lodging house was quiet. It was made of ivory silk, which she had bought from a merchant on the high street who had recognized quality hands the moment she touched the bolt and had charged her accordingly, though less than he would have charged anyone else. The cut was simple and the line was clean and there was no ornamentation. Because she did not want ornamentation, she wanted a garment that did what a garment was supposed to do, which was to say something true about the person wearing it. It said, this person is certain of what she is doing, this person is here entirely voluntarily, this person is herself. She carried no flowers, she carried the locket as always at her throat. The ceremony was brief and honest, the way she would have wanted everything to be brief and honest, and when it was over and she was standing in the cold, colored light of the chapel with her hand in his, she thought about the stone road in October, and the broken wheel and the 32 shillings, and the worn dress and the frightened child at the bottom of the staircase. She thought about all the things that had to happen, in that particular order, exactly as they happened, for this morning to be possible. She thought about her mother. She touched the locket. She looked at the colored light on the floor. The months that followed were full and various and complicated in the ways that real life is always complicated, not dramatically, not with the sharpness of crisis, but in the ordinary texture of two people building a life together in a large house with a garden and a child who had 9 beetles and a theory about snails. There were adjustments. There were rooms where she was not yet entirely comfortable and people who had not yet decided how to regard her. She met these with the same level gaze and straight back she had always used, because the materials of her character had not changed, only the circumstances around them. She kept her needle and thread. She kept her thread case, the one with 48 colors arranged lightest to darkest, her mother's. She took on no more commissions, but she did not stop working, because work was not a thing she did out of necessity alone, but a thing she did because it was hers. She mended things at the estate that needed mending. She taught Flora to sew simple stitches, which Flora took to with enthusiasm and very little patience, in approximately equal measure. She sat on the bench in the garden in spring when the rose bed woke up and the fountain was running. She walked the gravel paths in the evening sometimes and looked at the tree line against the sky and thought about the frost in October and what the garden had looked like then, all its bones showing through, structured and bare and honest. She liked it in all its seasons. The bones were what made it the same garden in every weather. The christening garments she had restored with such care in the linen room that spring were brought out of storage in the 2nd year of their marriage, because there was a new reason to need them. Flora had very clear opinions about this development, and stated them at some length over a period of several weeks, as she had opinions about most things. Her primary concern was whether the new person would be interested in beetles. She was told this was difficult to predict in advance, but that every effort would be made. Mrs. Colby, who had seen considerably more of life than most people, and was not given to demonstrations of feeling, stood in the doorway of the linen room when the garments were brought out, and looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, that it was good to have things used again. Elinor thought it was the truest thing anyone had said in a long time. The christening was small, like the wedding, in the chapel with the colored light. The garment held perfectly. Every stitch Elinor had put into it had held, because she did not put stitches into things that did not hold. Afterwards, in the garden in the mild afternoon, Flora held her new sibling with the careful formality of someone who has accepted a responsibility and intends to take it seriously. She looked down at the small face with an expression Elinor recognized, direct, assessing, taking things in piece by piece. She was her father's daughter. She was also, Elinor thought, watching her, beginning to be a little bit her own. Elinor stood in the garden with the rose bed behind her and the fountain running in front of her and the gravel path warm in the autumn sun, and looked at all of this. The house and the garden and the child and the small new person and the man standing beside her, not saying anything, just there, in the way he was always there now, which was the right kind of there, the steady kind. She touched the locket. She thought, I arrived in a worn dress on a broken road with 32 shillings and a plan that was already failing, and this is where it ended. Not ended, continued, that was the more accurate word. This is where it continued. She looked at the garden and the light on the grass and the long gravel path leading back to the house, and she thought that the things you cannot plan for are not necessarily the things that ruin you. Sometimes they are the things that find you before you would have found them on your own, arriving through a crack in the expected, a broken wheel, a frightened child, a workroom with a south-facing window and a basket of thread. The afternoon was warm and the garden was full of color, and everything was, for this particular moment, entirely at rest. Flora looked up from the small face in her arms and said to Elinor, with great seriousness, that she thought the baby was probably going to be interested in beetles. Elinor said she thought so too. Edmund looked at both of them with his whole open face. The fountain ran. The roses held their color in the last of the autumn light. And the garden, which had been bare and structured and honest the first time Elinor had walked in it, was full now, in the way that things become full when they are properly tended, with patience and with steadiness, and with the understanding that everything worth having takes its own particular time to come.